Now, as a next step, we're going to configure firewall rules for our EC2 instance. So when we deploy our virtual machine in the subnet, we want to be able to SSH into it. So we want to open port 22, as well as we want to be accessing the Nginx web server that we deploy as a container through the web browser. So we want to open port 8080 so that we can access from the web browser. So we're going to create a security group and open those two ports on our server. And in order to create a security group, we can use resource type AWS security group. And let's call it my app SG. And we're going to have a bunch of attributes in here. First of all, we have the name, which we can call it the same, my app SG. Then we have the VPC ID. So we have to associate the security group with the VPC so that the servers inside that VPC can be associated with the security group. And VPC ID, we're going to get, as always, from referencing our VPC. And this is the main or the interesting part where we define the rules, the firewall rules of the security group. So generally we have two types of rules, right? We have traffic that is coming inside the VPC and entering the servers. So it's the incoming traffic. For example, when we SSH into the server, when we access it from the browser, we're basically sending traffic inside the VPC into our EC2 instance, right? Into our server. And the incoming traffic or incoming traffic rules are configured using an attribute called ingress. So ingress for incoming. And inside ingress block, we have configuration for one firewall rule. And we have a couple of attributes here. First of all, we have from port. And for SSH port for 22, we're going to define it to be 22. And then we have to port. And we're going to also set it to 22. So why do we have two ports from and to? It's because we can actually configure a range. Right now, we're just setting it to one specific port, but we can also configure a range of ports to open in a security group. So if we want, for example, to open ports from 0 to 1000 on a single server, then we can have a range instead of one specific port. In our case, we just need port 22. So let's leave it at that. And then we have the protocol, which is just simple TCP. And then we have the source. So basically, who is allowed or which IP addresses are allowed to access port or port range defined here. And this is going to be CIDR block. So this is an IP address range or a list of IP addresses or CIDR blocks that are allowed to access port defined in here. And for SSH, as you know, accessing a server on SSH should be secure and not everyone should be allowed to do it. So you can have a handful of IP addresses that are permitted to do that. So for example, if you have a team of 3 DevOps engineers who are all accessing or SSHing into that server, you can define their IP addresses as a list here. In our case, we just have one, which is our local machine. So we're gonna define here our own IP address. And you can actually check that out very easily using a website or also just checking in your operating system and set it as a value here. But remember, this is not an IP address, it's a CIDR block, right? So you are defining a range of IP addresses, and since we just want one single IP address, not a range, we are gonna fixate it at 32. So this will map to this specific IP address. Now, if your IP address is dynamic, So if this actually changes a lot, you can configure it as a variable and access it or reference it from the variable value instead of hard coding it here. Or you can also have the whole list as a variable if you have a list of IP addresses that are also dynamic. But again, because we have just one, I'm gonna extract this value here and I'm gonna access it from a variable. And let's actually call it my IP so that I don't forget to declare and assign this value. I'm gonna immediately define it here, my IP. And let's also set it as a value in here. And there you go. So if this value changes, basically, I can simply change it here instead of going through the configuration file and scrolling through to see where I set it. And also I don't have to check this into the repository because this is the local variables file that we ignored. As you remember, in the git ignore, we just excluded it from being checked in because everyone can have their own copy of variables file and set their own IP address as well as other variable values here and have a local copy of the variables. So that basically configures one incoming rule for port SSH. Now we need a second one for port 8080. And I'm just gonna copy this one and we're gonna set the port to 8080. It's gonna be TCP protocol, and here we don't want to restrict it to any IP address because anyone can access it from the browser. So we're gonna set CIDR block to be any IP address that can access the server on port 8080. And this basically takes care of the incoming traffic rules, but we also have the outgoing traffic rules. And the exiting traffic can be configured using an attribute called egress. So ingress for incoming, egress for exiting. And the attributes for this are actually the same. The values are, however, different because we don't want to restrict the exiting traffic to the internet from the server. And examples of traffic that is leaving the server or leaving the VPC, our private network, is basically when you have to install something on the server. For example, when we install Docker or some other tools on our server, these binaries need to be fetched from internet, right? Or when we install some Linux packages, they have to be fetched and downloaded on the server from internet. Or for example, when we start a Docker container of Nginx image, for example, the Nginx image has to be fetched from Docker Hub, right? So this means that the request is going outside to the internet in order to fetch some resource. And of course, we want to allow that request to be able to leave the VPC and go get something from internet, but we don't want to restrict it on any port IP address. So we're gonna set it to any port by setting this to 0. And we also don't want to restrict the protocol. We're just gonna configure for any and any IP address, as well as just an empty prefix list IDs. It's just for allowing access to VPC endpoints. It's not very interesting for us. This will just allow any traffic to leave the VPC and the server itself. And this will configure all the rules in our security group. And finally, we can have the name tag. Let's actually just copy it from here and let's call it security group SG. And that's it. So now we can apply this configuration and create a new security group inside our VPC. So first let's do Terraform plan. And Terraform plan actually shows us an error on each line. And this is actually one very good feature of Terraform, that it has an inbuilt validation, right? So if I make some syntax error, if the attribute name isn't defined correctly, or maybe I am referencing a variable that hasn't been declared, or if something is wrong, basically Terraform validates this input and tells me exactly on which line what error I have. So in this case, I apparently forgot the S or the plural in CIDR blocks. So let's go back to configuration file. I have to specify CIDR blocks instead of CIDR block because it is a list. So let's save it, and I'm gonna do plan again. And this time the file is valid, and I see that security group will be created with all this configuration. So now we can actually apply this. And it got executed. So now in the VPC section, let's actually find security groups. It's right here. And as you see, we have 3 security groups here. One of them belongs to our default VPC of the region. The second one is the default security group of the VPC that we created, right? So remember I said that AWS creates some default components for VPC whenever we create one. Security group is one of them. So whenever we create a new VPC, a default security group gets created for that specific VPC with default configuration. And by default, security group is blocked. So all the ports are basically closed, so no traffic is allowed in. So this is the default security group of our VPC, and this is the security group we just created. And this is the name that we defined here. We have the name for the security group name column, and then we have the name tag, which is what we define in the tags. And now let's actually check the inbound rules for that. And there you go, we have the SSH type, port 22, my IP address, and we have TCP, custom TCP for port 8080 from all the sources. And outbound rule is what we configured here. And this basically maps to this entry, which basically says all traffic allowed, all protocols allowed, all port ranges for all IP addresses. This is what we configured with these attributes here. So security group is created, it is correctly configured and ready to be used and assigned to EC2 instance that we're going to deploy. Now, again, you may be wondering, what if we wanted to use the existing default security group? Because it comes out of the box when we create a new VPC. So can we reuse it? And the answer is yes, we can reuse the default one. We don't have to create a new one. And I'm going to show you the syntax for configuring default security group instead of creating a new one. So let's go back to our configuration. And it's actually very easy to switch from creating a new security group to default security group. So in the resource definition right here, we're gonna define AWS default security group resource type. So since there is just one default security group or default route table in a VPC, Terraform and AWS will know which specific security group that is. And we can also call it default security group. And as you saw, the name of the security group name is also default. We can actually remove it. And the rest of the configuration is actually exactly the same. We have the VPC ID, ingress rules, egress rules, and the tag we can actually add default in here and call it dev default security group. And let's now execute Terraform plan and see our changes. And as you see, one resource will be created and one will be destroyed. So basically we have removed one resource from the configuration file and we are defining a default security group, a new resource. So let's do Terraform apply, auto approve. And let us check this out. I'm gonna refresh and there you go. And if I click inside and see the outbound rules are basically allowing any traffic, and inbound rules, we have our custom TCP 8080 and SSH port 22. The group name is default as it was previously, and we have the tag name here. So that's how you can adjust an existing default security group, or basically just recreate or replace it instead of creating a new non-default security group in the VPC.